Livingstone, I presume. Good evening, world historians. Dr. Smith here. I hope you're all well. Probably most of you today would have difficulty recognizing either Henry Morton Stanley or David Livingstone from this 1871 illustration in the Daily New York Herald. But at the time, these were two of the most recognized characters, explorers in Africa, in the world, and as described in King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, the two men were some of the first Europeans to arrive in Africa and, in fact, to establish essentially the destiny of the continent with tragic consequences, obviously, for the people of the Congo themselves. Now, Livingstone, just to say a brief word about Livingstone, he is a guy like Henry Morton Stanley from a very poor background. Both of them were British. Stanley was from Wales. Livingstone was Scottish. Livingstone grew up not quite in as dismal circumstances as Stanley, but nevertheless in great poverty. His parents worked were initially handloom weavers and were moved into the factory system as a kid in Scotland. But Livingstone was able to work his way up the ladder through education, through scholarship. He was able to eventually study medicine at the University of Edinburgh, one of the great universities of the British Isles at the time, and went on to become both a medical practitioner and a religious missionary. He was also a committed Christian. So in the 1840s, he actually decided he was going to set out to China to preach the gospel and to practice his medicine. And around that time, as we'll talk about more later in this course, the Opium Wars break out between Britain and China. So rather than go to China almost by accident, he finds himself plying his trade in Africa, becomes one of the first European missionaries to make his way to what was then known as the Dark Continent, largely unexplored by Europeans. Discovers the Victoria Falls, the great waterfall of the African interior, and then attempts to chart the interior of the Nile, or the source of the Nile River, the longest river in the world, which at that time had not yet fully been discovered. On his expedition, he suffers from all sorts of horrendous conditions and diseases, which I will spare you the gruesome details, although he suffers from cholera, dysentery, tropical ulcers, which is ulcers that were infected with parasitic worms. Around 1870, he disappears off the map altogether and is believed to have perished. However, reports of his survival are emerging from the interior of Africa, kind of like nowadays, where people claim to have seen Elvis Presley. But at the time, the publicity-conscious editor of the New York Daily Herald, a guy called James Gordon Bennett, who was a great entrepreneur, decided he would hire Henry Morton Stanley to go after these reports, see if he could discover David Livingstone, which, of course, famously, this encounter between Livingstone and Stanley in the interior of Africa, modern day, roughly about where Tanzania is today, becomes headline making. Although there is an irony that Livingstone, who at the time had gone out to raise awareness and to work against the African slave trade, finds himself on the edge of death, being nursed back to health by, as you can see, these characters on the right of the picture who turn out to be Arab slave traders from the Indian Ocean region. Now, both Livingstone, Stanley find themselves in Africa for rather different reasons. Stanley, through his exploits, comes to the attention of King Leopold. But both men are part of this pioneering wave of European explorers who inadvertently or advertently end up laying the foundation for the Conference of Berlin in 1884, again described in Hochschild's book. So I won't go into too great a detail, except that this is really the culmination of what becomes known as the Scramble for Africa, very much driven by the leading German statesman Otto von Bismarck, who felt that for Germany to establish itself as a major world power at that time, which was its goal, it needed strong industry, it needed a strong military, a strong centralized government, but above all, it needed colonies, it needed an empire. And so this treaty, this conference, drags on for about a year, uh, draws in leading European diplomats, statesmen, and so on. This is where, of course, you see King Leopold lay claim to the Belgian Congo. There is an irony here that the prohibition of the slave trade is enforced through the Treaty of Berlin, but as we read in Hochschild's book, King Leopold's Ghost, this is as much a smokescreen as it is a instrument of humanitarianism. Although the slave trade is abolished in Africa through international law, it continues in other forms, particularly the rubber plantations in the Belgian Congo. There is also an attempt to defuse some of the conflicts which are emerging between the European powers over control of the colonies. The introduction of something called the principle of effectivity, which is little more than to say you have to be there on the ground. You have to, as a nation state, actively hold and develop possessions, build roads, build hospitals, build schools, that kind of infrastructure, which you can see, again, is being much neglected by the European powers. But what they don't neglect to do, helped by modern industrial technology, of course, and especially by the development of modern tropical medicine, which I think if you watch the Guns, Germs, and Steel episode, you can see how important that was for Europeans to be able to, if you like, enter into the interior of sub-Saharan Africa. You can see here that this map is late 19th century. Before 1880, virtually the whole of Africa was, if you like, unclaimed by Europeans. But by the end of the 19th century, and of course this is leading towards the First World War, you see huge swathes of pastel colors representing the different powers of Europe, the French, especially in North Africa, the British in Egypt, Sudan, South Africa, the Germans, even the Portuguese in Angola, Mozambique. And then right in the middle of it all, you have the Belgian Congo, or King Leopold's Free State, which ironically was 74 times the territory that Leopold himself laid claim to as King of the Belgians back in Europe. So when we meet back, we'll talk about the rising tensions, the rising nationalism, and the rising imperialism that set off the road towards the First World War in the 20th century. So we're still in the 19th century, but we're heading towards the 20th century. So that's where I'll leave you there. I hope you're all well, and take care and keep in touch. Thanks very much.